If this was the moment you expected to die, would you still believe everything you had been taught about your enemy? The rain had started before dawn and never stopped, turning the jungle clearing into thick brown mud that clung to boots and soaked through thin fabric. 8 Japanese nurses knelt in a crooked line, their hands resting on their thighs, their heads lowered against the cold drizzle. The air smelled of wet earth and distant smoke. Somewhere beyond the trees, engines idled softly, and metal gear clicked as American soldiers moved through the clearing. Aiko Tanaka felt the mud slowly seep through the knees of her uniform. She did not move. None of them did. They had been taught exactly how to kneel in moments like this. Of air. No one spoke. Rain tapped against metal rifles and dripped from the low branches above them. Somewhere behind Harper, another squad shifted position. A radio crackled briefly. Aiko kept her gaze on the mud, but something inside her began to change. The shouting she had prepared herself for never came. No one kicked over their supply bags. No one barked orders in anger. Instead, there was only the quiet sound of rain and the presence of the man standing in front of them, watching with the calm patience of someone deciding something important. Noise grew closer. A radio operator lifted his headset and listened carefully. Aiko did not need to understand the words to recognize the change in the air. The quiet calm of the clearing shifted into something sharper. The medic finished his work and helped the weak nurse sit more comfortably, but his eyes moved toward Harper, waiting for instructions. Harper glanced toward the approaching engines and then back to the kneeling women. For a brief second, his jaw tightened. He knew the unit coming down that jungle trail. Everyone in the battalion did. They had been fighting for days with almost no sleep. They had lost friends. They were angry, and anger moved quickly through men who had been living in the jungle for too long. Harper stepped forward 1 pace, positioning himself slightly between the nurses and the direction of the road. The movement was small, almost invisible unless someone was watching closely. Aiko noticed. Her eyes lifted just enough to see the outline of the American soldier standing there, rain running down the back of his jacket. The engines were now less than 100 yards away. Through the trees came the sound of tires grinding over wet ground. Another squad of American soldiers appeared at the edge of the clearing, their uniforms darker with mud, their helmets low over tired eyes. One of them shouted something across the clearing. Aiko flinched at the sudden voice. Several of the kneeling nurses lowered their heads even further. The new arrivals stopped when they saw the group in the mud. A moment of silence followed. A long moment. Then one of the men laughed dryly and said something to his companions, his voice carrying across the rain. Harper did not laugh. He walked several steps forward until he stood clearly between the new soldiers and the kneeling nurses. His posture was calm but unmistakably firm. The medic behind him slowly rose to his feet, watching carefully. The soldiers from the arriving unit approached slowly, studying the scene with curiosity and something else that Aiko could feel even without understanding the words. Harper raised one hand slightly, a gesture that was not aggressive but very clear. The men stopped walking. Rain continued to fall, tapping softly on helmets and leaves. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. Harper spoke then, his voice steady and measured. "They are medical personnel." He paused. For half a second, letting the words settle into the air before finishing the sentence. "They are under my protection." The statement hung in the clearing like something heavier than an order. Aiko did not understand the English words themselves, but she understood the tone. She understood the way the other soldiers looked at Harper after he said them. And slowly, for the first time since the moment of capture, she lifted her head enough to look directly at the man standing between them and the rest of the world. For several seconds no one moved. Rain continued to fall through the leaves, dripping from helmets and the edges of rifles. The men from the arriving unit studied the strange scene in front of them. His own people after long days in the jungle. The rain grew heavier for a moment, drumming against the leaves above them. Harper remained where he was, his body a quiet barrier in the clearing. Aiko realized something slowly. He was not simply standing there. He was holding the line. Not with anger. Not with force. With calm certainty. The tall soldier exhaled and wiped rain from his face with the back of his hand. He said something short to the men behind him, took a slow breath. He did not relax. Men who had spent months in the jungle did not relax easily. But the tension in his shoulders eased just enough that the medic beside him noticed. Aiko Tanaka felt the change as well. It was subtle, like the moment when a storm finally begins to move away from the mountains. No one had shouted. No one had given a dramatic speech. The line had simply been drawn, and the men around it had decided not to cross it. The medic returned to the nurse he had examined earlier, offering her a small canteen of water. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers shaking slightly as she lifted it to her lips. The other nurses watched with quiet disbelief. Aiko's thoughts felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath her had shifted in a way she did not understand. Everything she had been taught about this moment had prepared her for cruelty. The training had been precise. When captured, expect humiliation. Expect harsh treatment. Expect anger. Instead, there was rain, silence, and a soldier who seemed determined to treat them as something other than enemies. Harper turned and studied the women again. Mud clung to the edges of their uniforms. Their faces were pale with exhaustion. These were not fighters trying to hide behind a disguise. These were medical workers who had stayed with wounded people long after retreat had become the safer option. He had seen enough battlefields to recognize that kind of person. Somewhere near the trucks, a radio operator spoke quietly into a headset, repeating coordinates and listening for new instructions. The jungle road behind them had become busier as additional vehicles moved through the area. A convoy was forming. Harper looked toward the vehicles and then back at the women. Soon they would be moved to a larger holding area miles away from the front lines. The war would continue somewhere else. But this moment belonged to the small clearing and the people standing inside it. Aiko noticed Harper watching the road, calculating distances and time. She had seen the same look on doctors before difficult operations. A quiet planning that carried responsibility. The rain had left small pools across the clearing. Aiko shifted slightly, her knees aching from the cold mud. One of the American soldiers noticed and gestured gently for the women to stand. The motion was careful, almost respectful. Slowly, uncertainly, the nurses rose to their feet. For a moment, several of them wavered with fatigue. The medic stepped closer, ready to steady them if necessary. Aiko stood as well, brushing mud from her hands. The world looked different from this height. She could see the American soldiers more clearly now. Their uniforms were worn, their faces tired. They looked less like the terrifying figures from propaganda posters and more like ordinary men who had been walking too long in the rain. Harper stepped aside slightly, but remained close enough that the space between the two groups felt deliberate. Not a barrier of fear, a boundary of responsibility. Aiko glanced at him again. He was already speaking with another soldier about the trucks and the route ahead. His voice carried the calm rhythm of someone used to making decisions while the world around him remained uncertain. The jungle wind moved through the leaves above them, carrying away the last of the storm. And as Aiko stood in that quiet clearing surrounded by people who had once been only enemies, she felt something unfamiliar growing in the space where fear had been moments earlier. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of a question she had never allowed herself to ask before. What if everything she had believed about this war was incomplete? The convoy did not leave immediately. In war, nothing moved as quickly as people expected. Orders traveled through radios, maps were checked again, and trucks waited with engines idling while decisions were made miles away by officers who had never seen the muddy clearing. The American soldiers moved through quiet routines. One checked the tires of the transport truck. Another adjusted the canvas cover stretched over the back. Someone passed around a dented metal coffee pot that steamed gently in the humid jungle air. The smell drifted across the clearing, warm and unfamiliar. Aiko Tanaka stood beside the other nurses, her legs still stiff from kneeling too long in the mud. None of them spoke. They had learned to move together without words during the long nights inside field hospitals. But the silence between them now felt different. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of people trying to understand something that did not match the stories they had been given. One of the younger nurses glanced nervously toward the American soldiers and then back at Aiko. Aiko gave the smallest shake of her head, a quiet signal to remain calm. Across the clearing, Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper stood beside the truck, studying a folded map that another soldier held open against the hood of a vehicle. His finger moved slowly along a narrow jungle road marked in pencil. The medic stood nearby, listening. Harper nodded once, then folded the map carefully and handed it back. The conversation was practical. Distance, fuel, timing. Yet every few seconds Harper's eyes drifted back toward the group of nurses, as if confirming they were still there. Aiko noticed this. She noticed many small things now. The way Harper spoke without raising his voice. The way the other soldiers listened when he gave instructions. The way the medic had returned twice already to check the nurse who had nearly collapsed earlier. These were details no training manual had ever mentioned. A soldier approached the nurses carrying a small wooden crate. He set it down a few feet away and stepped back, gesturing gently with his hand. Inside the crate were metal canteens and several wrapped food rations. The gesture was simple. No dramatic explanation. Just food placed within reach. The nurses stared at the crate as if it were a puzzle they did not know how to solve. Aiko hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. Her movements were careful, deliberate. She knelt beside the crate and lifted one of the canteens. The metal felt cool against her palm. She unscrewed the cap slowly and took a small sip. Clean water. Not bitter. Not rationed down to a few drops. Just water. She passed the canteen to the nurse beside her. One by one the others drank. A few feet away, Harper watched quietly, making no comment. For him, it was a small thing. A routine act that soldiers repeated every day across hundreds of miles of jungle road. But for Aiko it was something else entirely. In the distance the jungle insects had begun their evening chorus. The storm clouds were drifting apart, revealing thin bands of pale sunlight through the treetops. The trucks were almost ready now. Engines turned over one by one, their low rumble filling the clearing. Harper stepped toward the nurses and gestured calmly toward the back of the transport truck. The meaning was clear even without translation. It was time to move. The nurses climbed slowly into the truck bed, steadying each other as they stepped onto the wooden platform. Aiko was the last to climb aboard. As she turned, she saw Harper standing beside the vehicle, one hand resting on the metal frame as he watched to make sure everyone was safely inside. Their eyes met again for a brief moment. Still no words. Yet the meaning between them had already begun to change. Not enemy and captive. Not soldier and prisoner. Something quieter than that. Something that had begun the moment one man chose where the line would stand in the middle of a rainy jungle clearing. The truck rolled forward slowly, its tires sinking slightly into the soft jungle road before finding traction again. The canvas cover above the wooden bed fluttered gently as the convoy began to move through the narrow path cut between thick trees and tangled vines. Inside the truck, the 8 nurses sat close together on the wooden benches that lined the sides. The smell of wet canvas mixed with damp earth and engine fuel. For several minutes no one spoke. The movement of the truck felt strange after hours of stillness. Aiko Tanaka held the metal canteen in both hands, feeling its cool weight against her palms as the vehicle bounced gently over uneven ground. Through a narrow opening in the canvas, she could see the jungle sliding past, mile after mile of dense green that seemed endless. Somewhere near the front of the truck, Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper rode beside the driver, his shoulder close to the open window so he could watch the road ahead. Every few seconds his eyes moved to the side mirror mounted on the door, checking the convoy behind them. 3 trucks, 1 jeep, all moving in a careful line through the narrow jungle road. Harper had made the same journey many times before. Prisoners were moved from forward areas to larger camps farther inland, where they could be processed and registered. It was routine. Yet this convoy did not feel routine. He could still picture the moment in the clearing when the second unit had arrived. The tension, the questions, the quiet decision that had followed. Soldiers were trained to follow orders, but sometimes a moment arrived where judgment had to fill the space between those orders. Harper had stepped into that space, without announcing it. Now the road stretched ahead for another 20 miles before the next checkpoint. In the truck bed, Aiko listened to the steady hum of the engine and the rhythm of tires against wet dirt. The nurse who had nearly collapsed earlier leaned quietly against the canvas wall, her breathing steadier now after water and rest. One of the younger nurses held her hand as the truck swayed gently around a bend in the road. None of them had spoken about what had happened in the clearing. The moment felt too fragile for words. Instead, they watched the small details around them. The careful way the American soldiers walked beside the convoy when the road narrowed. The medic who occasionally glanced back through the canvas opening to make sure everyone was steady. The quiet professionalism that seemed to guide every movement. Aiko had spent years learning how soldiers behaved in battle zones. She had seen many kinds of men pass through field hospitals. Brave men, frightened men, angry men. Yet the soldiers escorting this convoy carried themselves with a kind of calm discipline she had not expected. It was not kindness exactly. It was something steadier. Something built from routine, responsibility, and a belief that certain lines should not be crossed even in the middle of war. The truck climbed slowly up a narrow ridge road. From the opening in the canvas, Aiko could now see the sky through breaks in the jungle canopy. The storm clouds had begun to separate, revealing a pale stretch of afternoon light across the horizon. Harper noticed the same change from the front seat. Sunlight touched the edge of the road ahead, turning the wet leaves silver. He leaned slightly out the window and studied the hills ahead. Somewhere beyond those hills stood the temporary camp where the prisoners would be registered and housed. It was still hours away. He rested one hand against the door frame and glanced once more at the mirror. Through the dusty reflection, he could just see the canvas truck behind him where the nurses rode. 8 figures moving farther from the front line with every mile. For them, the war had just changed direction. For Harper, it continued exactly as before. Yet somewhere between the rain-soaked clearing and the winding jungle road, he felt the quiet weight of a decision that would likely never appear in any report or official record. The convoy moved deeper into the hills as the afternoon light slowly returned to the jungle sky. The road narrowed as the convoy climbed higher into the hills, the jungle pressing close on both sides like a living wall of leaves and tangled branches. The trucks slowed to a careful crawl, their engines working harder as the incline grew steeper. Sunlight began to break through the thinning clouds above, sending pale shafts of light down through the canopy. Inside the transport truck, the change in light softened the dark interior, turning the canvas walls from dull gray to a faint gold color. Aiko Tanaka noticed it immediately. The jungle no longer looked like the endless storm-soaked maze it had been hours earlier. Now patches of sky appeared through the trees, bright and distant. The nurses shifted slightly on the wooden benches as the truck climbed. One of them leaned closer to the canvas opening and looked out quietly, her eyes following the narrow road twisting along the ridge. For the first time since their capture, the atmosphere inside the truck felt less heavy. The steady movement of the convoy created a rhythm that slowly calmed their nerves. The nurse who had been weakest earlier now sat upright, her breathing more stable. She held the empty canteen carefully in both hands, as if it were something fragile. Across from her, another nurse adjusted the cloth bandage around her wrist that the American medic had wrapped earlier. Small acts of care that had not been demanded or negotiated, simply given. At the front of the convoy, Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper leaned slightly forward in the passenger seat of the lead truck, studying the road ahead. The jungle ridge curved sharply along the hillside, and the driver slowed again to guide the vehicle through a narrow turn. Harper glanced at the side mirror once more, confirming that the trucks behind them were still in line. The canvas-covered vehicle carrying the nurses bounced gently over the uneven ground but remained steady. Harper had escorted many convoys through roads like this. Prisoners, supplies, wounded soldiers, radio equipment. Everything moved through these jungle roads eventually. Yet something about this particular convoy kept drawing his attention back to the truck behind him. Perhaps it was the quiet discipline of the nurses. Perhaps it was the memory of the moment. In the clearing when the second unit had arrived. Moments like that stayed with a soldier longer than most people realized. In the back of the truck, Aiko watched the passing jungle carefully. She had spent much of the war inside buildings or temporary shelters, tending to patients while the outside world remained distant and chaotic. Now she was seeing the land in a different way. The hills rolled outward in long green waves. Tall trees rose above the road like silent towers, their branches filled with birds that called out as the convoy passed below. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost impossible during wartime. The truck suddenly slowed again. The convoy had reached a small wooden bridge spanning a shallow river that wound through the valley below. The driver guided the truck carefully across the narrow planks. The wheels rattled softly over the boards, the sound echoing beneath them. Several soldiers stepped down from the vehicles to walk beside the trucks while they crossed, their boots striking the wood with steady rhythm. Aiko leaned slightly closer to the opening in the canvas and saw Staff Sergeant Harper step out from the lead vehicle and walk along the side of the bridge as the trucks passed. He watched each vehicle carefully, making sure the crossing remained stable. His movements were calm, methodical, almost routine. Yet to Aiko the sight carried quiet meaning. The same man who had stood in the rain earlier was now walking beside the convoy, ensuring that everyone crossed safely to the other side of the river. When the final truck rolled off the bridge, Harper climbed back into the lead vehicle and signaled the driver forward. The convoy resumed its climb through the jungle hills. Behind them, the small river continued its slow path through the valley, reflecting the returning sunlight. And inside the canvas truck, Aiko Tanaka sat quietly with the other nurses as the war carried them farther away from the moment that had already begun to change the way she understood the people around her. The convoy continued deeper into the hills as afternoon sunlight slowly filtered through the thinning jungle canopy. The road widened slightly after the bridge, giving the trucks more room to move. Engines hummed steadily, and the smell of warm metal and damp earth filled the air as the vehicles climbed higher along the winding ridge. Inside the canvas truck, the light had grown brighter, revealing the tired faces of the 8 nurses more clearly than before. Mud had dried along the hems of their uniforms, leaving faint brown stains that marked the morning's rain and the long hours behind them. Aiko Tanaka sat quietly near the opening in the canvas, her eyes following the rhythm of the road ahead. The steady motion of the truck had begun to dull the sharp edge of her fear. It had not disappeared, but it had changed shape, becoming something quieter and more thoughtful. Across from her, one of the younger nurses finally spoke in a soft voice, the first words any of them had said since leaving the clearing. The question was simple. Where were they going? No one answered immediately. No one knew. They understood only that the road was carrying them away from the front lines, away from the collapsing field station they had refused to abandon until the last moment. For months they had worked beside wounded men who had arrived faster than they could be treated. Now the silence inside the truck felt almost unreal. The medic who rode in the back of the convoy lifted the edge of the canvas briefly and looked inside. His expression was calm as he checked on them again. When he saw that the nurse who had nearly fainted earlier was sitting upright, he nodded once and let the canvas fall closed. The gesture was small, almost routine, yet Aiko noticed the care behind it. Outside the truck, the jungle had begun to thin along the ridge, revealing distant hills stretching across the horizon. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper noticed the same change from the lead vehicle. He leaned slightly toward the open window, letting the warm air rush past his face as he scanned the road ahead. The convoy was making good time now. The map he had studied earlier suggested another 10 miles before they would reach the temporary processing camp. A cluster of tents, supply sheds, and radio towers hidden among the hills. Nothing permanent. Just another small piece of the war's machinery moving quietly across the landscape. Harper adjusted his helmet and glanced again at the mirror mounted beside the door. Through the reflection, he could see the canvas truck following behind them, bouncing gently over the uneven road. Somewhere inside that truck were the 8 nurses who had knelt in the mud hours earlier, waiting for a fate that had never arrived. Harper did not think of himself as a man who made dramatic choices. Soldiers in his position learned to focus on practical things. Roads, distances, fuel, orders. Yet every so often a moment arrived that was not written in any manual. A moment where a soldier had to decide what kind of war he was willing to fight. The jungle wind moved through the trees above the road, carrying the sound of birds across the hills. In the back of the truck, Aiko watched the light shift across the canvas walls as the convoy rounded another bend. She thought again about the moment in the clearing, about the way Harper had stepped forward without raising his voice, about the quiet certainty in his posture as he spoke to the other soldiers. War had taught her many lessons about suffering and endurance, but this was different. This was something she had not expected to witness at all. As the convoy moved farther along the ridge, the road opened briefly to reveal a wide valley below, filled with bright green fields and scattered streams reflecting the afternoon sun. The sight lasted only a few seconds before the jungle closed in again, but the image stayed with Aiko long after the truck turned back into the trees. For the first time since the war had pulled her into its endless motion, she allowed herself to imagine a world beyond the next battlefield. A world where the line between enemy and stranger might not be as permanent as she had once believed. The road began to level as the convoy moved out of the steeper hills, and onto a broader stretch of packed dirt that wound along the edge of a wide valley. The jungle no longer pressed as tightly against the road, and for the first time in hours the trucks moved at a steadier pace. The engine beneath Aiko Tanaka vibrated with a constant low rhythm that seemed to echo through the wooden benches where the nurses sat. Outside, the late afternoon sun had grown warmer, touching the tops of the trees with a golden light that softened the hard edges of the jungle landscape. Inside the canvas truck, the atmosphere had changed in small but noticeable ways. The nurses were no longer sitting as rigidly as they had earlier in the day. Shoulders had lowered. Breathing had slowed. The quiet fear that had once filled the truck had gradually given way to something more thoughtful. Aiko still held the canteen loosely in her hands, though it was nearly empty now. The cool metal had become a strange comfort, a reminder of the unexpected moments that had unfolded since morning. Across from her, the youngest nurse was studying the small bandage wrapped around her wrist, carefully adjusting its edge as if trying to understand the unfamiliar kindness that had placed it there. Outside the truck, the convoy continued forward in careful formation. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper sat beside the driver in the lead vehicle, one elbow resting lightly against the door frame as he watched the road stretch into the distance. The valley below opened wider now, revealing narrow streams that reflected the sunlight like thin ribbons of glass. The air had grown warmer as the storm clouds finally disappeared behind the hills. Harper checked the mirror again. The canvas-covered truck carrying the nurses followed steadily behind, its wheels sending up small clouds of dust as the road dried under the returning sun. For a moment he allowed his mind to drift back to the clearing where the day had begun. The rain, the tension, the quiet line that had formed between two groups of soldiers who were both tired of the war in different ways. That moment had passed quickly, yet it had left something behind that Harper could not quite explain. Soldiers were trained to recognize threats, to anticipate danger, to move forward even when uncertainty filled the road ahead. But sometimes the harder decisions were the ones that had nothing to do with tactics or strategy. Decisions about what kind of men they would be when the war eventually ended. Behind him in the truck bed, Aiko watched the changing landscape through the opening in the canvas. The valley seemed almost peaceful compared to the battlefield she had left behind. Tall grass moved gently in the wind across the slopes below, and distant birds circled slowly above the trees. It was the kind of quiet scenery she had once known before the war had reached her homeland and carried her far across the ocean. She realized then how strange the journey had become. Only hours earlier she had believed the moment of capture would mark the end of everything she understood. Instead, the road had carried her through a series of small, unexpected gestures that had begun to reshape her understanding of the people she had once been taught to fear without question. One of the nurses beside her leaned slightly toward the opening in the canvas and watched the lead truck moving ahead of them. Aiko followed her gaze. Through the shifting dust, she could just make out the figure of the soldier sitting in the passenger seat, his outline steady against the bright sky beyond the windshield. Staff Sergeant Harper never looked back at that exact moment, yet Aiko felt certain he was aware of the truck behind him, just as he had been aware of them in the clearing earlier that day. The convoy continued along the valley road as the afternoon sun slowly drifted lower in the sky, carrying everyone inside the trucks toward a destination none of them had yet seen, but all of them would remember for the rest of their lives. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the distant hills when the convoy finally reached the edge of the valley road. The jungle thinned gradually, replaced by scattered clearings and long stretches of grass that moved softly in the evening wind. The truck slowed as the road curved toward a cluster of low canvas tents and wooden supply sheds tucked between two ridges. A tall radio tower rose above the camp like a thin metal needle, its cables stretching down toward generators that hummed steadily in the warm air. Inside the transport truck, Aiko Tanaka felt the engine vibration begin to ease as the vehicle reduced speed. The nurses shifted slightly on the wooden benches, sensing that the journey was nearing its end. Through the canvas opening, Aiko could see soldiers moving around the camp entrance, their uniforms dusty from the long day. Some carried clipboards. Others moved crates from one truck to another with quiet efficiency. The convoy rolled forward another 50 yards before the lead vehicle stopped near the main tent line. One by one the trucks behind it slowed and settled into place, engines idling softly before shutting down. The sudden quiet felt almost startling after hours of steady movement. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper stepped down from the passenger side of the lead truck and stretched his shoulders. Briefly as he scanned the camp, a few officers approached from the tent area, their expressions focused but calm. Harper exchanged several quick words with them while pointing toward the canvas truck behind him. The conversation was brief, professional, and without ceremony. Orders were confirmed. Names would be recorded. Medical checks completed. Another routine piece of the war's machinery continuing its slow work. Yet Harper lingered for a moment before walking back toward the transport truck. In the back of the vehicle, the nurses had already begun to stand carefully, steadying themselves after the long ride. The wooden boards creaked softly beneath their feet. When Harper reached the side of the truck, he placed one hand against the metal frame and looked up toward them. His voice was calm as he gestured toward the ground, signaling that it was safe to step down. The nurses climbed down one at a time, their movements cautious but steady. Aiko was the third to descend. When her feet touched the dry ground, she paused for a moment, adjusting to the stillness after so many miles of motion. The camp around them was quieter than she expected. There were no raised voices, no hurried shouting, only the low hum of generators and the distant clatter of equipment being organized for the night. A medic approached again, this time with a small clipboard in hand. He offered a brief nod and began speaking slowly, using simple words and careful gestures to guide the nurses toward the medical tent where their conditions would be checked. The process was orderly and calm, exactly the kind of routine Harper had described earlier when speaking to the other soldiers. Aiko walked with the group across the packed dirt toward the tent line, her eyes taking in every detail of the unfamiliar camp. Lanterns had begun to glow near the entrances of the tents as evening approached, casting warm light across the clearing. Soldiers moved quietly between the structures, their footsteps steady and purposeful. Before entering the medical tent, Aiko glanced back once more. Staff Sergeant Harper still stood near the transport truck, speaking briefly with another soldier while watching the nurses reach the tent safely. When their eyes met across the open space, he gave a small nod, nothing dramatic, simply an acknowledgement that the long road from the jungle clearing had reached its end. Aiko returned the gesture, with the slightest incline of her head before stepping inside the tent with the others. Behind them, the sun slipped lower toward the horizon, casting a final band of gold across the valley as the camp prepared for another quiet night far from the front lines. Inside the medical tent, the air felt cooler than the warm valley outside. Lantern light hung from a metal frame above, casting soft circles of yellow across folding tables and stacked crates of medical supplies. The smell of antiseptic and clean cloth drifted through the space, a scent Aiko Tanaka knew well after years spent inside field stations that never seemed to have enough of either. The 8 nurses stood quietly near the entrance as an American medic finished preparing several forms on a wooden table. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, the same calm efficiency Aiko had noticed throughout the convoy's journey. One by one, the nurses were guided forward for a brief examination. Pulse checked. Temperature measured. Simple questions spoken slowly in English, while the medic used gentle gestures to make the meaning clear. The process felt surprisingly familiar. In another place, under another flag, Aiko might have been the one performing these same checks on newly arrived patients. When her turn came, she stepped forward and sat on the wooden chair beside the table. The medic examined the bandage around her wrist, replacing it with a fresh wrap before making a short note on his clipboard. He offered a small nod of reassurance before moving on to the next nurse. Around them, the tent remained quiet except for the soft scratch of pencils and the occasional murmur of instructions. Outside the canvas walls, the camp had settled into its evening rhythm. Boots moved across packed dirt. Distant voices called out inventory numbers. Somewhere a generator shifted its steady hum as the power load changed. After the final nurse had been examined, the medic set down his clipboard and pointed toward a row of smaller tents visible through the open flap of the medical tent. Inside those tents, several wooden cots had been arranged with blankets neatly folded at the foot of each bed. Aiko and the others were guided there without urgency, simply directed to a place where they could rest after the long day. The nurses entered the tent quietly, each choosing a cot and sitting carefully, as if unsure whether. The moment was real. The canvas walls rustled softly in the evening breeze. For the first time in many weeks, Aiko felt the strange stillness of a place where no wounded soldiers were waiting outside the door. Across the camp, Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper stood beside the transport truck while another soldier completed the final entries on a clipboard. Harper listened as the soldier confirmed the arrival time, the prisoner count, and the transfer to medical supervision. The report was routine. 8 nurses delivered safely to the processing camp. No incidents during transport. Harper signed the form with a short motion of his pencil. The paperwork was folded and handed off to the camp officer who had arrived earlier. For a moment, Harper remained standing beside the truck, looking across the rows of lantern-lit tents. The sky above the valley had deepened into a soft evening blue, and the first stars were beginning to appear above the distant hills. He could see the tent where the nurses had been taken, its lantern glowing faintly through the canvas. The long road from the jungle clearing had finally ended. Harper adjusted his jacket and began walking toward the mess tent where the rest of the convoy crew had gathered for a late meal. Behind him, the camp continued its quiet routines, another day of the war settling into the valley night. Inside the small tent, Aiko Tanaka lay back on the narrow cot, her hands resting lightly over the folded blanket. The lantern above swayed gently in the evening breeze, sending soft shadows across the canvas ceiling. For a long moment, she simply listened to the distant sounds of the camp. The quiet footsteps, the low voices, the hum of generators in the dark. None of it felt like the end she had once expected. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a question she would carry long after the war itself had faded into memory. The night settled gently over the valley camp as the last traces of daylight faded behind the distant hills. Lanterns glowed in neat rows between the tents, casting soft circles of light across the packed earth paths that connected the small structures. The air had cooled slightly, carrying the faint scent of grass and damp soil from the surrounding fields. Inside the tent where the nurses rested, the quiet had deepened into something almost peaceful. Aiko Tanaka lay on the narrow cot with her eyes open, watching the lantern sway gently from the metal frame above. The movement was slow and steady, like the rhythm of breathing after a long day. Around her, the other nurses had begun to settle into sleep. One shifted softly beneath a thin blanket. Another murmured in her dreams before growing quiet again. The exhaustion of the past weeks had finally begun to claim its due. Yet sleep did not come easily for Aiko. Too many images from the day moved through her thoughts. The rain falling across the jungle clearing. The sound of boots in the mud. The moment when Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper had stepped forward without raising his voice and drawn a quiet line that no one had crossed. She had replayed that moment again and again as the convoy traveled through the hills. It was not dramatic. There had been no shouting, no grand declaration. Only a calm certainty that had changed everything. Outside the tent, the camp continued its quiet routines. Soldiers finished their evening meals in the mess tent before returning to their assigned posts. A pair of mechanics worked beneath a lantern beside one of the trucks, tightening bolts loosened by the long road through the hills. Farther away, a radio operator adjusted a headset, while copying down a transmission that crackled softly through the night air. The war continued to move around the camp like a distant current, steady and unavoidable. Near the edge of the clearing, Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper stood beside a wooden fence line that overlooked the dark valley below. He held a metal cup of coffee in one hand, the steam rising faintly in the cool air. The stars had grown brighter above the hills now, scattered across the sky like distant lanterns of their own. Harper took a slow sip and listened to the sounds of the camp settling into night. This part of the day was often the quietest. The hours when soldiers had time to think about the choices they had made before the next orders arrived. Earlier that evening, he had passed the row of tents where the nurses were resting. He had not stopped. There was no need. They were safe inside the camp now, under the watch of medics and officers who would follow the regulations written for prisoners of war. Yet, the image of the jungle clearing still lingered in his mind. The rain, the silence, the moment when the path of the day could have turned in a very different direction. Harper had simply done what seemed right at the time. Nothing more, nothing less. But as he looked out across the dark valley, he understood that small decisions carried weight long after they were made. Inside the tent, Aiko finally closed her eyes, letting the quiet sounds of the camp settle around her. The fear that had filled her earlier that day had faded into something softer, something she could not yet name. She did not know what the coming days would bring inside this unfamiliar camp. She did not know how the war would end or where the road ahead might lead her. But one truth had already taken root in her thoughts. Somewhere between the rain-soaked clearing and the lantern-lit tents of the valley camp, she had witnessed something that no training had ever prepared her for. In the middle of a war that had divided nations and filled oceans with distance, a single choice had reminded her that humanity could still survive inside the most unlikely places. Morning arrived slowly over the valley camp, the pale light of dawn spreading across the hills and turning the low mist above the fields into soft silver ribbons. The lanterns that had burned through the night were being extinguished one by one as soldiers moved quietly between the tents, beginning the first routines of a new day. Somewhere near the motor pool, a truck engine coughed to life before settling into a steady idle. Metal tools clinked softly against the side of a crate as mechanics prepared vehicles for the road ahead. The war had its own rhythm, and dawn always restarted it. Inside the small tent where the nurses had rested, Aiko Tanaka woke to the faint sound of boots passing outside. For a moment she lay still, unsure where she was. The canvas ceiling above her moved gently in the early morning breeze, and the quiet hum of the camp slowly returned to her memory. The clearing, the convoy, the long road through the hills. She sat up carefully, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face as sunlight slipped through the open flap of the tent. Around her the other nurses were beginning to stir as well. One stretched quietly. Another sat at the edge of her cot, looking out toward the rising sun as if trying to measure the distance between yesterday and today. The fear that had once filled their movements was gone now, replaced by the cautious awareness of people who had entered a world they were still learning to understand. Outside the tent, the camp had already begun its morning routine. Soldiers carried crates of supplies toward the storage shed while a medic prepared a small folding table for the day's medical checks. The valley air was cool and clean, and the hills beyond the camp glowed softly under the early light. Aiko stepped out of the tent and paused for a moment, letting the morning breeze move across her face. She could see the narrow road that had brought them here, winding back through the trees toward the distant jungle. Somewhere beyond those hills the battlefield continued, but the valley camp felt like a quiet pause between two chapters of the same long story. Near the transport truck, Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper stood speaking with another soldier while reviewing a folded map. The conversation was brief. Another convoy would be leaving later that morning to carry supplies farther along the valley road. Harper finished the discussion and folded the map carefully before glancing across the camp. His eyes moved across the tents, the medical station, and finally the small group of nurses standing near their shelter. For a moment his expression remained neutral, the steady composure of a man who had learned not to attach meaning to every encounter during wartime. Yet something in his posture softened slightly as he saw them standing there under the rising sun, no longer figures kneeling in the mud, but individuals beginning another day. Aiko noticed him at the same moment. The distance between them was only a few dozen yards, yet the space carried the quiet weight of everything that had happened since the rain-soaked clearing. She lowered her head slightly in a respectful bow, a gesture that required no translation. Harper answered with the smallest nod before turning back toward his duties. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. The day moved forward as the camp continued its work, but for Aiko Tanaka the memory of that single moment would remain long after the war itself had ended. Years later she would remember the rain falling in the jungle clearing, the convoy winding through the hills, and the quiet soldier who had chosen to protect rather than condemn. History would record the battles, the campaigns, and the shifting lines across maps. But for those who had stood in that clearing, the most powerful memory would not be of victory or defeat. It would be the simple reminder that even in the middle of war, dignity could still be defended by one calm voice and one quiet decision.